For most of her adult life, Meera Raman believed kindness was a form of weakness people used to excuse their failures, and she wore her strictness like armor, polished daily through routines so precise they left no room for chaos, no room for excuses, and certainly no room for mistakes. And every morning she woke before sunrise in the quiet apartment she shared with her husband Arith, preparing his breakfast exactly at 6, ironing his shirts with perfect creases, arranging everything in symmetrical order. Because order was control and control was safety, and she had learned long ago that safety did not come from trusting others, but from managing them. Arif used to joke, gently at first, that she ran their home like a military camp, but over time the jokes faded, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that settles into marriages when one person stops expecting to be understood. And Meera noticed it but did not acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that perhaps her way was not perfect, and perfection was the foundation she had built her entire identity upon. She worked as a school administrator, a role that suited her, where rules were clear and authority unquestioned. And students feared her sharp eyes and measured voice, and teachers respected her efficiency even when they resented her rigidity. And she told herself that respect mattered more than affection, that results mattered more than feelings, and she believed it, because believing it made her strong. But strength, she would later learn, is sometimes just another word for distance. The swap happened on an ordinary Wednesday, a day so unremarkable it almost seemed chosen deliberately by fate, and Meera remembered every detail with unsettling clarity. The way the sky had been gray with unfallen rain, the way she had scolded a young teacher for arriving 3 minutes late, the way she had ignored the tired look in the woman's eyes because excuses were irrelevant. And that night, exhausted but satisfied with her control over the world, Meera fell asleep believing tomorrow would be exactly the same. Instead, she woke in a bed that was not hers. At first, she noticed only the unfamiliar ceiling, cracked in one corner and stained by years of neglect. And confusion settled over her slowly, like fog rolling in from a distant shore. And when she sat up, the room spun with unfamiliarity. The walls painted a faded blue she would never have chosen, the air heavy with a scent she did not recognize, and panic rose in her chest as she realized she did not know where she was. She rushed to the mirror, her heart pounding with urgency, and when she saw her reflection, she did not see herself. The face staring back at her was younger, thinner, framed by loose strands of uncombed hair, and her first instinct was denial, the belief that she was dreaming. But the sensations were too real. The cold floor beneath her feet, the uneven rhythm of her breathing, the overwhelming certainty that this was no dream. She stumbled backward, her mind racing for explanation, but explanations did not come easily to someone who had always believed the world followed rules, and this had broken every rule she knew. The apartment she stood in was small, cluttered with signs of a life lived without order, dishes left unwashed, clothes folded imperfectly, books stacked without symmetry, and she felt an instinctive irritation rising inside her, the familiar urge to correct, to organize, to impose control. But beneath that irritation was something new and unfamiliar, something quieter, uncertainty. On the small table beside the bed sat a phone, old and worn, and when she picked it up, she saw messages waiting, dozens of them. And the name at the top froze her breath. It was the young teacher she had scolded the day before, Sana. Somehow, impossibly, Meera was inside Sana's life. At first, she rejected the reality entirely, convinced it was a hallucination, a punishment, or madness. But reality persisted with stubborn indifference to her disbelief, and when the phone rang and she answered without thinking, hearing a voice call her Sana, with casual familiarity, she felt the fragile structure of her certainty begin to collapse. She left the apartment in a daze, stepping into a world that looked the same but felt entirely different. And people looked at her without fear, without respect, without expectation. And she realized with quiet horror that she was invisible in a way she had never experienced before. Not invisible physically, but socially. Her authority stripped away, her identity erased. And as she walked through the streets, she saw details she had never noticed before. Exhaustion in strangers' faces, frustration hidden behind polite expressions, the quiet weight people carried without acknowledgement, and for the first time, she was not above them, she was among them. When she arrived at the school, her school, and walked through the gates as Sana, no one stepped aside, no one lowered their voice, no one straightened in her presence, and she watched from within another person's body as the world she had controlled continued without her, and she saw herself, her own body, standing in the courtyard, moving with the same rigid posture, the same cold efficiency, and seeing herself from the outside was like seeing a stranger, someone distant and unapproachable, someone she suddenly understood in a way she never had before. Throughout the day, she lived Sana's life, and she felt the constant pressure Sana carried. The long hours, the quiet anxieties, the effort of trying and still falling short of impossible standards. And she remembered the way she had dismissed those struggles as weakness, and now, feeling them firsthand, she understood they were not weakness at all but endurance. Every sharp word she had spoken returned to her, not as memory, but as experience, and she began to see the cost of her strictness, the invisible wounds she had left in others, wounds she had never intended but had caused nonetheless. That night, alone in Sana's small apartment, Mira sat in silence, surrounded by imperfection, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel the urge to correct it, because she understood now that perfection was not what people needed most. What they needed most was understanding. And as she lay down in that unfamiliar bed, uncertain of whether she would wake as herself again, she felt something inside her shift, something fundamental and irreversible, because for the first time, she had seen the world without the shield of authority, and once seen, it could never be unseen, and whether she returned to her own life or remained trapped in this borrowed one, she knew one truth with absolute certainty, that the woman she had been could no longer exist unchanged. The next morning, Mira awoke with a desperate hope that everything would be restored, that she would open her eyes and see the familiar cream-colored ceiling of her own bedroom, hear the faint hum of the air conditioner Aris insisted on keeping too cold, feel the reassuring weight of her own identity settling back into place. But when she opened her eyes, the cracked blue ceiling remained, unchanged and indifferent to her longing, and the realization settled into her chest with quiet finality. She was still Sana. For several minutes, she lay there without moving, staring upward, as if refusing to acknowledge the truth might undo it, but denial had never solved anything. Not in her life before, and certainly not now, and she forced herself to sit up, her body still unfamiliar, her hands still wrong, thinner, weaker, carrying a softness she had never allowed herself to have. The phone buzzed beside her, and she hesitated before looking at it, because every message was a reminder that she was living someone else's unfinished story. And when she finally picked it up, she saw a message from the school's main office, a reminder of a staff meeting that morning, mandatory attendance, and her stomach tightened instinctively, not because she feared the meeting, but because she knew who would be leading it, herself. She dressed slowly, struggling with clothes that did not carry the crisp certainty she preferred, fabric slightly worn, color slightly faded, and she felt an unfamiliar discomfort, not just physical but emotional, the discomfort of realizing how different her own life had been from the lives of those she managed. When she arrived at the school, the building felt larger somehow, less under her control, and as she walked through the halls, she noticed conversations stopping not out of respect, but out of routine. And no one looked at her with fear, no one adjusted themselves in her presence, and she felt the strange vulnerability of existing without authority. The meeting began in the staff room, and she sat among the teachers, her heart pounding as she watched her own body enter the room, her posture straight, her expression composed, and she had seen herself in mirrors every day for years, but seeing herself now, from the outside, she was struck by something she had never noticed before. How cold she looked, how distant, how unreachable, and she watched as her other self spoke, her voice firm, controlled, outlining new policies, stricter deadlines, higher expectations, and she saw the teachers' reactions clearly now. The subtle tension in their shoulders, the forced nods, the silence that was not agreement but resignation, and for the first time, she understood that their obedience had never been respect, it had been fear. She watched Sana's colleagues glance at her, at the body she now occupied, and she saw the quiet sympathy in their eyes, the shared understanding of pressure, and she realized Sana had never been weak. Sana had simply been human in a system Mira had refused to see as human. At one point during the meeting, her own body called Sana's name sharply, criticizing a minor delay in grading reports, and Mira felt the words land, not as authority, but as humiliation. And the room remained silent, and she understood now how isolation could exist, even in crowded spaces, how loneliness could grow inside people who were surrounded by others, but never truly seen. She wanted to speak, wanted to defend Sana, wanted to defend herself, but she remained silent, because she did not yet know her place in this fragile reality. The rest of the day passed slowly, each moment revealing something new, something uncomfortable, something true, and she began to notice the small kindnesses people gave each other: shared lunches, quiet encouragement, patient understanding. Kindness she had once dismissed as unnecessary, and she realized now those small kindnesses were what allowed people to endure the weight of their lives. When the final bell rang and the students left, she lingered behind, watching her own body moving efficiently through the halls, and she wondered what Arif was experiencing, whether he knew something was wrong, whether he noticed the difference, or whether he felt relief in the absence of her strictness, and the thought unsettled her more than she expected. That evening, back in Sana's apartment, she sat beside the window watching the fading light, and she thought about control, about how tightly she had held it, believing it protected her, believing it defined her, and she began to question whether control had ever truly been strength, or whether it had been fear disguised as certainty. She remembered her childhood, the unpredictability of her father's temper, the chaos she had escaped by becoming disciplined, precise, untouchable, and she realized now that strictness had not been her nature, but her defense, a way to ensure she would never again feel powerless. But now, living inside Sana's fragile, imperfect life, she was powerless again. And yet, she was also seeing things she had never seen before, feeling things she had never allowed herself to feel. And she began to understand that vulnerability was not the enemy she had always believed it to be. That night, before falling asleep, she made a quiet promise, not knowing how long this swap would last or how it would end, but knowing that if she ever returned to her own life, she would not return as the same person, because she had seen the cost of who she had been and she could no longer pretend it was worth it. In the days that followed, Mira stopped waiting to wake up as herself, because hope without action began to feel like another form of imprisonment. And instead she began to live the life in front of her, not as an observer trapped in someone else's existence, but as a participant responsible for it. And that shift, small and quiet, changed something fundamental inside her. She noticed first how exhausted Sana's body felt by midday, the kind of exhaustion that settled into muscles and bones from constant effort without relief. And she remembered how easily she had dismissed fatigue in others, how she had believed endurance was simply a matter of will. And now she understood that will was often the only thing people had left when everything else had been taken by obligation. One afternoon, as she sat grading papers at Sana's small desk in the shared office, she noticed another teacher, a man named Imran, sitting nearby, staring blankly at his own stack of unfinished work, his face drawn with quiet defeat. And she remembered how her former self would have responded, with criticism, with reminders of deadlines and responsibilities, with pressure disguised as professionalism. But now she hesitated, aware of something she had never considered before, the possibility that pressure did not create strength but only revealed suffering. Without fully understanding why, she spoke gently, asking if he was all right, and he looked at her with surprise, as if kindness itself were unexpected, and after a moment, he admitted that his mother had been ill, that he had spent nights in the hospital, that he was trying to keep up, but felt like he was failing. And Mira listened, truly listened. Not as an administrator evaluating excuses, but as a person hearing another person's pain. And she realized how rarely she had ever done this before, how rarely she had allowed others to exist beyond their performance. She offered to help him finish some of the grading, and he hesitated at first, pride and habit holding him back, but eventually he accepted, and as they worked together in quiet cooperation, she felt something unfamiliar but deeply grounding: connection without authority, presence without control. The next day, she arrived at school early, not out of obligation, but out of intention. And she noticed a student sitting alone on the steps outside the building, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed on the ground, and Mira recognized that posture immediately, the posture of someone carrying something too heavy to share. And in her former life, she might have walked past without noticing, focused on efficiency, on structure, on maintaining distance. But now she stopped, sitting beside the girl without speaking, allowing silence to exist without pressure. And after a long moment, the girl began to talk, haltingly at first, about struggles at home, about fear, about feeling invisible. And Mira listened, offering no solutions, only presence. And she realized that sometimes kindness was not about fixing anything. It was simply about witnessing someone's existence without judgment. Each small act of kindness changed her in ways she had not expected, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, like ice melting under steady warmth. And she began to see the world differently, not as a system to be controlled, but as a fragile network of lives intersecting in quiet, meaningful ways. she also began to notice changes in her own body, not physical changes but emotional ones. The absence of constant tension, the unfamiliar ease of existing without maintaining authority, and she wondered whether her strictness had ever truly protected her, or whether it had only isolated her behind walls she had built herself. One evening, as she walked home through the crowded streets, she saw a reflection of herself in a shop window, Sana's face looking back at her, and she no longer felt the same resistance she had felt before, because she realized that identity was not as fixed as she had believed, that who she was had never been defined solely by her body or her position, but by her choices. And she understood now that she had spent years choosing distance when she could have chosen understanding. That night, as she lay in the small bed that had once felt like a prison, she found herself thinking less about escape and more about meaning, less about returning to her old life and more about who she would be if she did. And for the first time since the swap had begun, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, not confusion, but gratitude, because this experience, as terrifying and disorienting as it had been, had shown her truths she would never have seen otherwise. Truths about others, truths about herself, truths about the quiet power of kindness, and she understood now that kindness was not weakness, it was courage. The courage to see others fully, the courage to exist without armor, the courage to be changed. The return happened without warning, as quietly and mysteriously as the swap itself had begun, and Mira did not realize it at first, because she woke in darkness, her mind still drifting between two identities, two lives, two versions of herself that no longer felt separate. And for several seconds she lay still, afraid to open her eyes, afraid of losing what she had gained, afraid of returning to the person she had once been. But when she finally opened them, she saw the familiar cream-colored ceiling of her bedroom, smooth and perfect and unchanged, and her breath caught in her throat as recognition settled into her bones, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding, her hands trembling as she stared at them. Her own hands, stronger, older, carrying the history she had once taken for granted, and the realization filled her not with relief alone, but with responsibility. She was herself again. The apartment was silent, the early morning light barely touching the edges of the room, and everything was exactly where she had left it. Every object in its precise place, every surface controlled and ordered. But she no longer saw perfection when she looked around. She saw distance. She saw emptiness. She saw the quiet absence of warmth she had mistaken for strength. Arif was still asleep beside her, his breathing steady, unaware that the woman lying next to him was no longer the same person he had known, and she watched him for a long moment, noticing details she had never allowed herself to notice before, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed heavier even in rest, and she felt a quiet ache of understanding, because she realized now how her strictness had shaped him too, how her control had created silence where there could have been closeness. When he woke, he looked at her with mild surprise, sensing something different he could not yet name. And she smiled, not the polite, controlled smile she had practiced for years, but a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and he stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. That morning she did something she had never done before. She asked him how he felt, not out of routine, but out of care, and he hesitated, confused by the question, unused to being asked, and she waited patiently, giving him space to answer, and when he spoke, slowly, cautiously, she listened without interrupting, without correcting, without controlling, and in that moment, something fragile began to grow between them, something that had never existed before. When she returned to school, the building looked the same, but she walked through its halls differently, not as a commander maintaining order, but as a person moving among other people, and she saw them clearly now, their tired smiles, their quiet efforts, their hidden struggles, and when the staff meeting began, she stood in front of them as she always had, but instead of speaking immediately, she paused, allowing herself to feel the weight of her words before she said them, and she acknowledged, for the first time, that she had been too harsh, that she had forgotten the humanity of the people she worked with, and the room fell into stunned silence, not out of fear, but out of disbelief, and she saw in their faces the same uncertainty she had once felt, the uncertainty of witnessing change that seemed impossible. She did not explain the swap, because some truths exist beyond explanation, but she let its lessons guide her, and over time her strictness softened into structure balanced with compassion, her authority reshaped by empathy, and she discovered that kindness did not weaken her leadership, It strengthened it, creating trust where there had once been only obedience. Her relationship with Arif changed too, slowly and imperfectly as all real change does, but they began to speak more openly, to share silence without distance, to exist beside each other without fear of judgment. And she realized that kindness was not a single act but a continuous choice, a way of being that required courage every day. Sometimes, she would see Sana in the hallway, the real Sana, living her life unaware of the strange exchange that had connected them. And Mira would feel a quiet gratitude she could never express, because through Sana's life she had found her own. She never forgot the woman she had been, the strict, untouchable version of herself who believed control was the only path to safety. But she no longer resented that woman, because she understood now that she had been shaped by fear, and fear can be unlearned. In its place, she chose kindness, not because it was easy, but because it was stronger. And as the days turned into months and the months into years, the change within her became not an effort, but a truth. And she understood, finally and completely, that the swap had not simply changed her life. It had given her the one thing she had never allowed herself before, the freedom to be human,